start making some choices that you don't approve of. And these are choices that set them on what you believe to be a destructive path, or path away from God. And you want to reach in and fix it for them. And of course, at that stage of the game, you can't. And so, really what we're talking about this evening is how do you cope with that? How do you deal with kids who, as they begin to transition into adulthood, they head off in a different direction, one you don't approve of. How do you deal with that? That's going to be the subject of our study this evening. Before we do, let's go to God. Our Father, we are so very thankful for this beautiful spring day you've given us. We are thankful for the warm sunshine, the gentle breeze. We're thankful for many other markers of your role in this world in which we live, and the generous gifts that you have provided us in this life. We acknowledge and we pray you help us to always maintain grateful hearts in recognizing the role that you play in our lives and providing for us. We are thankful for this quiet evening hour that we're able to come together and so to study your word, to encourage each other, to better prepare ourselves to serve in your kingdom. We are thankful for the children that you have blessed us with and for the joy and happiness they bring into our lives, but we know that with that joy also comes a great many disappointments and challenges, and pray you would grant us the wisdom that we need to know how to handle the various problems, challenges that come our way as parents. Most of all, Father, we're thankful for your Son, Jesus. We see in the life that you live and the sacrifice you made for us on the cross and finally the resurrection from the dead. The answer to all of the problems and worries that we have to face in this life. We know that through what you did, we have the hope of life eternal in paradise. Help us to think that, Lord Father, we'll not be able to make our way through this life with joy and eager anticipation of what lies before us. Continue to be with us through this hour of study, whatever time remains to us in this life. Hope if I'd turn the microphone on. Okay, so we're talking tonight about when kids go bad. The first thing we want to acknowledge is if you find yourself in that situation and your kids are going off the rails in a direction that you don't approve of, know that you are in good company. When you study the Bible, how many cases of good parents having bad kids do you read of? I just have a few listed up here. Samuel the prophet and was a good man. He's the one that almost single-handedly helped Israel transition from the judges period to the monarchy. A great man who accomplished a great deal in a very difficult time in the nation's history. And yet his sons were just scoundrels. In fact, we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 3, they did not walk in his ways. And there comes this long list of all the atrocities that his sons were committing, to the point, in fact, it was his boys that really prompted Israel to demand a king. They were just fed up with the way that Samuel's sons were behaving. And so here you have a case of a good man, in fact, one of the men that we consider to be a hero in the Bible, and yet his children turned out pretty rotten. Also, David and Absalom is the classic case. David, of course, was the young man who was anointed by Samuel to be the king of Israel, and through all the trials and tribulations that David went through. And again, he's another one of these men that we put up on a pedestal. He's one of our Bible heroes. And yet, when you look at the lives of his children, especially after his affair with Bathsheba and all the fallout from that, it's clear that David just failed in the raising of these kids. Absalom in particular really stands out. What happened to Absalom in the end? How did he die? Well, hung by his hair. Was it just an accident? No, not his brother.
Quick, give me the story. How did Absalom die? What were the circumstances? Why was he hanging from a tree? He rebelled against his own dad, right? Absalom, he not only went off the reservation, he went after his own father. And Joab, of course, finally took the initiative to take him out, kill him. And then when David heard news that Absalom, his son, had died, he cried, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, O Absalom, my son, my son." His grief was so overwhelming that even the men who fought to save him and his throne were discouraged. Why did we fight then, if this is the way you're going to treat somebody who's trying to kill you? And of course, why would David say something like, "I wish that I had died in your place"? Well, obviously sorrow, but it goes a little deeper than that. Well, it's love for his son. Okay. He was at least partially to blame for this, right? In fact, his affair with Bathsheba, what did the prophet Nathan tell him? That because you have done this, the sword will not depart from your house. And the story of Absalom, his son, is just a classic case of a parent having to watch his child destroy himself, basically. And David felt at least partially responsible for that. Hezekiah and Manasseh, going down through the stream of time. Hezekiah, of course, is a descendant of David, another king of Judah. And Hezekiah came to the throne at a very critical time in Judah's history. The Assyrian Empire was sweeping through. They'd already taken the 10 northern tribes into captivity, and they were threatening Jerusalem. And Hezekiah was the good king who stood firm, and along with Isaiah beside him, these two men saved the kingdom at a very critical time in their history. And Hezekiah is again remembered as one of the great heroes of the Bible. But then when he died, his son Manasseh came to the throne, and Manasseh was an absolute monster. He was one of the worst kings that Judah ever had. The record tells us in 2 Kings 21 that he shed very much innocent blood till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other with the blood of the innocent. And there's a long catalog of the atrocities that this man committed. And he reigned for 50 years. And you can imagine the damage that a man like that could do to a kingdom in that period of time. So how can you have a good man like Hezekiah who stood fearlessly in the face of all the evil and the threats against his kingdom, and he clung to God with all his heart, produce an idiot like Manasseh? I mean, how do you explain that? How's that? We just don't know. Yeah, that's right. What were the other influences involved there? Yeah, and you make a good point. There's so much in the backgrounds of these families that we just don't know the details. So we have to be careful in assigning blame. But clearly, just because a parent is good does not guarantee the child is going to be good, right? I mean, that's really the pattern that we're seeing here. And then, of course, Josiah and his sons. Josiah was the last good king of Judah. And he was a decent, honorable man who at a very young age recognized that his kingdom, his people, were in very serious danger. And he turned with all his heart to God. He did the best that he could. In fact, the book of 2 Chronicles tells us that he had instituted a Passover feast that was unlike any Passover that had been celebrated since the days of Samuel, several hundred years before. This man was so determined to bring his people back to God. Unfortunately, he was killed at a young age in a battle with the Egyptians, and then in turn he had 3 sons, and there was a grandson in there. But he had 3 sons that came to the throne following him, and all 3 of these men were extremely foolish. They had no concern for God. They had no concern for truth and righteousness and doing the right thing for God and his people. And it was at that point that God just finally pulled the plug. Babylonians came in and took them all into captivity. But again, how do you explain the fact that you've got such a good, decent man in Josiah, and then his children were just worthless? He was very young, yes, yeah. But he had several years to grow into that role.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess what I'm thinking is his father wasn't able to show him how to do it.
Well, no, we don't know that. We're just not sure. But the fact that whatever role his father played, for sure Josiah overcame any negative influence of his parents and was a good man himself. But for some reason, it just didn't translate to his relationship with his sons. So really what I'm trying to say is, yeah, Lenny's? You're anticipating me. Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. We're tracking here. Yeah. Very much free will plays a huge role in this. But here's the clincher. These Bible heroes are not the only ones who know what it's like to lose a kid to the world. God himself understands the pain that you feel as a parent of a wayward child. Here's just a few examples out of the Old Testament. Isaiah 1 and 2. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. Isaiah 30 verse 9. This is a rebellious people, lying children, children who will not hear the law of the Lord. Jeremiah 4:22. My people are foolish. They have not known me. They are silly children, and they have no understanding. They are wise to do evil, but to do good, they have no knowledge. Ezekiel 2:4. They are impudent and stubborn children. Now this is God talking about his people, his children. He calls them my children. Was God a faulty parent? No. He was the best parent that anybody could ever hope to have. And yet God knew the frustration of seeing these people in whom he had invested so much of his energy and his love and affection just turn on him and go off in a completely different direction than what he wanted them to go. So the point I'm trying to get across to us here is if you ever find yourself as a parent in a position of watching one or several of your children head off in the wrong direction and you're powerless to do anything about it, understand God feels your pain. He knows exactly what you're dealing with. So don't beat yourself up and think, I have failed as a parent because my kids have gone off in a different direction. Now, no doubt, as a parent, you've made mistakes. We're not God. All of us as parents have made mistakes. And those of us who have good, decent kids who have stayed on the right and true path, we can attribute a good bit of that to the grace of God, not our brilliance as parents. But the fact that you're dealing with a child who's gone off in the wrong direction does not necessarily mean that you're a bad parent. Why do kids go bad? There are several reasons that we can point to, and of course we have to acknowledge that parenting mistakes can contribute to this. We've seen several examples of it already. We can, in the earlier years, we can be too lenient and just kind of let the kids get by with murder and they establish some bad habits. Or we can also be too strict. We can just so try to force our children into a template that they resent it, and they can actually rebel in response to our strictness. Or maybe we're just too indifferent. We're too busy. We're too involved in other things in our lives to give our children the kind of attention that they need to really get them well grounded. So obviously parenting mistakes can play a role in this, but there are other elements as well, cultural influences, especially today. When our children are surrounded by a lot of social media, Sam addressed this on Sunday morning in his sermon, the movies they watch, the music that they listen to, the videos that they will see on social media, influences at school. When I grew up, school personnel and parents were pretty much on the same page. And if you got in trouble at school, what was going to happen when you got home? Yeah, because parents and teachers were just in sync about what it took to get our children going in the right direction. That's not necessarily true today, especially if you're in a public school. I recognize there are some exceptions to that, but there are just influences that our children are exposed to today that just make it problematic to keep them on the straight and narrow. We also have to acknowledge the possibility, in some cases, of childhood trauma. Especially this can be the case in, we'll talk next week about special families, when you're dealing with adoption, kids that come from broken homes and really bad environments into a good home. There's a lot of baggage those kids carry with them that you don't have any control over. And that's going to be part of your challenge in raising those kids up in a decent environment now. But then there's one more thing, and Lanice has already talked about that, and that is the fact of free will. And we talked about this in an earlier lesson, that when we were talking about why are kids the way they are, and there are a number of things that contribute to a child's way of interacting with the world. But the big one, especially as they get older and they reach a point where they can make moral decisions, is free will. They are free moral agents, and they have the ability to make decisions, to make choices on their own, to decide what direction they're going to go. And that's why you can find cases of really good, decent parents who did an outstanding job, a stellar job of raising their children, all the elements of teaching and instruction and discipline and setting a good example and everything else that we really emphasize as essential to good parenting. Parents can do all of that very well and still have a kid that chooses to reject it. And there's just no explaining that other than the free will element. And Ezekiel addresses this. Ezekiel 18 and verse 20, the soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. The point that the prophet is making here is that every one of us, including our children, especially as they reach the age of accountability, where they are responsible for their choices, each one of us has to answer directly to God. We can't blame it on our parents. We can't blame it on the people around us. We have to recognize the fact that every one of us, our children included, have to choose what direction they're going to go in life. And so the main thing I'm trying to establish thus far in this study this evening is if your kids have chosen to go off in a different direction than what you've tried to train them to, don't beat yourself up over it. You are still responsible for your life. Don't let the decisions of your children drag you down into an existence of despair and hopelessness, and now I failed and I'm worthless and I'm no good because I didn't do my kids right. Well, that's not necessarily so. You still have a life to live as a parent. You still have your own decisions that you have to make, whatever your kids choose to do. And that's what you need to focus on. And your children, are going to be making their decisions. And they, like you, are going to have to answer to God for it. It's the role of free will in the life of each one of us. So then, in the time that remains to us, we want to address a question in very practical terms. How do we respond to a child that goes off in a different direction from what we have trained them? How do we deal with that? And I want to approach this from the standpoint of some do's and some don'ts. There are some things that we really need to be careful that we do not do. Things that can actually pour gasoline on the fire, make it worse if we're not careful. But at the same time, there are some other things that we do need to be careful to execute in our relationship with these kids. So let's talk about the don'ts. First on the list, don't make excuses for your child who has decided to go off in the wrong direction. And by excuses, I'm talking about things like, well, yeah, I know he does this, but he's basically a good kid. But he's, terrorizing the neighborhood and just being an absolute idiot in his behavior. Well, that's not basically a good kid. Don't make an excuse for him. Or, my child is just so mistreated by the world and the people at school and all the other folks and the things that happen to him in his life, and you just don't understand. Well, if he's a grown adult, whatever happened to him earlier might help explain it, but it doesn't excuse it. And parents need to be careful that they do not start covering their child's misbehavior with these kinds of excuses. Likewise, do not enable bad behavior. If your kid is strung out on drugs, and I'm just using this as an example, don't pay off the kid's drug debt when his drug dealer starts pressuring him for money just to get him out of trouble. What are you doing when you bail him out in a case like that? You're making it possible for him to stay on that same track. This is one of those cases where a young person just has to learn from his mistakes. And so we need to be careful that we do not enable the bad behavior that they are involved in. Another no-no is don't become angry and bitter. Now this is understandable. If you're watching a child that you have poured 18, 20 years of your life into, just reject everything you've tried to teach them, and they're just doing some absolutely stupid things, making some choices that are bad for them, and they're ruining their lives by what they're doing. What's a parent's natural reaction to that? Get angry, right? You want to grab the kid by the collar and shake some sense into him. And it's very easy, especially if you try to talk to the child and the child starts talking back at you, that can degenerate very quickly into just a free-for-all. This loud, angry ranting at one another. What does that accomplish? Well, worse than nothing. What does it do? What does the child read into your behavior now? The child says to you, you are the very reason that I'm going this direction. I despise you for the way you're treating me right now. Now, you may have every right in the world and a legitimate reason up to a point, to be angry at your child. But if you express it with this kind of just an angry outburst, just screaming and yelling at your kid because of his poor choices, all you're doing is reinforcing in your child's mind they have a right to do what they're doing because you're such an idiot. Is that the message you want to send to your kid? No. So as hard as it is, as difficult as it is, and as much as you have to bite your tongue until it bleeds, don't get out of control angry when you're dealing with your kid who is going off in the wrong direction. And then here's another one. Now this one is controversial, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but let's just talk about it. Don't sever all connection with the kid. I have known some parents, faithful, loyal members of the church, one of their kids goes really bad, makes some very bad decisions, and the parents just cut them off. I will not have anything more to do with you because, the Lord says, have no fellowship with evil, and you're evil, so I can't have anything to do with you. And we'll literally cut them off. We'll not see the grandkids. We'll have nothing at all to do with them. What does that accomplish? Well, yeah, I mean, what you've done is burned bridges. You've basically destroyed any hope of there ever being any kind of reconciliation. Now, again, I say this is controversial because I hear brethren argue both sides of this. But in my experience, and just watching other families navigate these waters, I've come to the conclusion that, yes, the relationship is not the same that it used to be, and it can't be when your child is going off in a different direction than you are. But still try to keep the lines of communication open. Maintain some kind of relationship with your child. And that brings us then to the do's. And the first do is be clear about your disapproval, but also be clear about your love. Now, what do I mean by be clear about your disapproval? Right. Now, does that mean you have to rub it in their face every time you see them? No. You don't have to just harp on it all the time. But there needs to be, at some point early in this process, there needs to be a heart-to-heart talk explaining why you think they're making a wrong decision, and then let it go. Let them know that you love them, at the same time not making excuses or enabling bad behavior. I mean, there's some lines here that you need to recognize, but let them know that you still love them, you still care for them, you don't agree with the choices that they're making in their life. Set a good example in the decisions that you make, in the way that you behave, in the frustrations and hardships and challenges of life. Set a good example of how to deal with all of that. Now, they may not like you for whatever reason, but at least you're modeling good behavior that they can at some point recognize. Seek counsel from other parents. This is not a burden you have to carry alone. If you're struggling with a situation like that, seek out other parents older than you who have been down this path and they've had to deal with their wayward kids, and seek their wisdom. Find out what they had to deal with and how they dealt with it. You can gain a lot of valuable information from older parents and how they had to deal with this sort of thing. Be patient. Rome wasn't built in a day. Did you need other people to be patient with you when you were young? Yeah. I mean, we can all look back at some stupid things that we did. So, we kind of have to be patient with our kids, even when they're doing foolish things that we don't agree with. And then last, pray. This keeps coming up again in our study. You need to pray for your kids, and especially those who are making foolish choices in their life. Now, we really don't have much time at all, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time here talking about the ultimate wayward child, and that's the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. We don't have time to go through this, but just consider some questions here. Why did the younger son leave? Just a quick description. I'm sorry? He was impatient, yes. There's one particular detail, though, that really strikes to the core of his character. What was the demand he made of his dad? What language did he use? What was the language that he used? What words did he use? He said to his father, give me mine. Give me. What does that tell us about his character? Selfish. This young man, for whatever reason, had developed a very selfish outlook on life, to the point that he was willing to use his own dad to gain personal advantage. How did the father react to his son's behavior? Did he slap him across the face? Did he berate him? He gave it to him. Why? Was arguing with this boy going to change anything? No. How was the only way this boy was going to figure out that he was making a mistake? The hard way. He's going to have to learn the hard way. Dad was actually using a little bit of wisdom here and saying, son, you're on your own. And when the son went off to this far land, did Dad go chasing after him? No. Do you think Dad knew where this was going? Of course he did. And then what motivated the son to return? And this is huge. Two things. First of all, where did his decision-making lead him? At rock bottom. He ended up in a pig pen with nothing. And it's interesting, the text says, and nobody gave him anything at that point. But while he's there in the pig pen, it says he came to himself, and the first thing he said was, how many of my father's servants have plenty to eat? And here I am in the pigsty. What's he thinking about? Well, it's not just the mistake that he made. Yes, he did. But how many of whose servants? My father's servants. Did living under his father's roof look any better now? What was his plan of action? What did he know at that point that he needed to do? Go back to his dad and be restored. How did the father receive him? You idiot. You think you're going to, after what you did to me, you're going to come back and just expect to be welcomed with open arms? Grovel. Pay me back before I'll take you back. Is that the way his dad treated him? What did he do? He opened his arms, embraced him, kissed him. You kill a fatty calf, celebrate it. Yeah. Why? He was glad to see his son back. He didn't rub his son's face in all the sins that he had made. And then finally, how did the older brother receive him? This is the counterbalance here. Yeah, the older brother is everything we should not be in welcoming back a wayward child. So anyway, hopefully this lesson this evening has been helpful to you in that regard. Next week we're going to be looking at special families. Not just special needs families, but families involving things like adoption, foster parents, blended families, single parent families. I mean, there are a lot of different parenting situations that we're going to be addressing in next week's lesson. Okay, thank you very much.